me think of Victorian England, I don't know about you, but I think instantly of the likes of Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, and of course all those gaslit streets, normally frequented by excellent writers, Punch magazine, Charles Dickens, all of that sort of era, you know, the hansom cab. There was, of course, the sound of clattering horses on cobbles. This was Victorian London. But of course there was a darker side to Victorian London, one that even the late monarch, Queen Victoria, got involved in. As ever, let me explain. Morning, how are you? Nice to see you. You see, you're all a bit intrigued now, aren't you? It's a bit darker, isn't it? Yes, it's a bit like one of those haunted London things. By the way, I've got to tell you this did make me laugh. You know, we did a story about Angela Rayner's portrait. Somebody said, if anybody's got a haunted house, well, then that'll get rid of the ghost. You kind of think, stop it. So cruel, but very funny. Of course, ghosts were a big thing in Victorian England, right? No two ways about it. And another big thing, a story that's really interested people for many decades is this, that of the infamous Jack the Ripper. And the reason why I wanted to share this particular story with you recently is, today, is I was recently working with the Royal Collection Trust, and they've got fascinating things all about, exactly the royal connections. And I mentioned to you before how Queen Victoria, sorry, we haven't had a wave, Bobby, nice to see you, sorry. Queen Victoria often, would go round in the sort of darkness of Whitechapel to see exactly for herself how things were happening. She was kept in touch by all of her prime ministers at the time and leading ministers about really what was going on to find Jack the Ripper. It's hard to imagine now what an impact that particular story had for this simple fact. Also, when you think about it, this was a soap opera played out literally in the daily papers. This saw the very much rise of the newspaper because every single day and every time there was a tragic murder, well, sales went up. Now the story, of course, goes is what was the royal connection between Jack the Ripper and royalty? And everybody knows the background to that particular story. But what's interesting was, and what's emerged since, actually this was started by one of the most scurrilous editors of what we would now call a tabloid newspaper. By linking the royals, of course, he could get headlines and people were shocked, stunned and all of that sort of stuff. So what happened to Queen Victoria and her involvement? Well, as I said, basically, she didn't want to necessarily come out too much in either side. This was because you have to remember just how genteel the ladies were of the day. I mean, I know this sounds incredible, but you have to remember also ladies could not visit for afternoon tea unless there were a certain amount of ladies present. And if a man was to attend, oh, scandal. You see, this is the thing. It was a totally different time. Queen Victoria, of course, didn't have that problem, but she couldn't necessarily address certain situations. The only way she could get things through was to offer advice and certain ideas that she'd been passed on to her by people, perhaps servants that were working inside Buckingham Palace or Clarence House, something like that, and a direction that she might suggest to Scotland Yard. Also, remember at this point, the Metropolitan Police, the British Metropolitan Police, was burgeoning at that point. And this was the time really where everybody was looking for an answer so desperately. As many people know, of course, a similar situation happened many years later with the so-called Yorkshire Ripper. And I remember that story incredibly well. So Queen Victoria, what she actually did was to make sure that she was fully across the entire story, but more so, all thanks to many of the servants. Well, she then decided, well, what about having, say, the courts illuminated throughout the night? What about better lighting in that particular area so that these women, sad that it was that they had to do that particular job, at least felt safe? She suggested an increase in police. But again, she was kicked back time and time again, not because she was the monarch, but in fact because she was a woman. A woman, even a monarch like Queen Victoria, couldn't suggest such ideas. Hence the reason she let it be known to the Met Police and the British Prime Minister at the time that she was taking frequent trips around Whitechapel to see for herself just how bad it was. And then what happened behind the scenes, what many people don't realise, is many of her staff were also secretly interviewed because the police were looking at all angles. They felt that actually somebody at the very higher echelons, whether that be a doctor or indeed a servant working inside the royals, could they be connected? This is all due to the medical situation that, of course, we know Jack the Ripper used in his way of getting rid of people, shall we say, put it politely. So for all those that thought Queen Victoria didn't do anything, she tried her best, but in a very difficult woman's world. As she pointed out when she contacted her ministers, I need to know every single day what you're doing to make my subjects safe on the streets in these terrible areas. They tried to sweep her under the carpet. She wasn't having it and held many to account. More importantly, she fell out with her Prime Minister on numerous occasions because as each murder came around, of course, the public became more frantic. So what's interesting to find when you look in the documents is, while Queen Victoria is seen as an uncaring, cold and removed person, as ever, behind the scenes, she was actively doing her best to find out and put an end to what became the infamous story of Jack the Ripper in Victorian London. Neil Sean in the very heart of Yorkshire.